The, um, the way I wanted to approach the question of Obama's foreign policy is from the perspective of grand strategy. One of the interesting things about U.S. foreign policy is that by law, every president has to have a written national security strategy published. And in principle, at least, it's reasonable to assess the foreign policy of an administration against their own expectations, against their own logic as set out in these strategies. So that's one starting point. The question that I'm going to focus on is the question of why it seems that American foreign policy has changed much less from Bush to Obama than many people would have expected. Right? The rhetoric is fundamentally different. The actual practice of what the U.S. does is not so fundamentally different. So what I'm going to talk about is that question. Assess a bit Bush's grand strategy, both the document and the practice, then compare that to Obama's grand strategy. So just to give a sense of this, some examples of the continuity. I mean, this is all obvious to you. This is, by the way, a talk written for a more general audience, so I'll try to deepen it a bit as we go, but just so you'll know. You know all this, but just to list it, Guantanamo Bay is still open as a detention center for terrorist suspects. Obama is proceeding with the military tribunals, the basis for which was laid in the Bush administration. There's been no significant opening to Iran. The war in Afghanistan continues. The missile defense program continues. The status quo in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains unbroken. And even when you have these uprisings, especially in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, very, very cautious American reaction. Almost all of these things are just straight continuations of Bush policy. Not to say that there's been no change in U.S. policy. You have the New START treaty with Russia, so nuclear arms control has been revived. You have the drawdown in Iraq, which even that is actually a slightly accelerated implementation of a treaty that was signed by President Bush. You have the famous Cairo and Prague speeches of reconciliation. And then, of course, there's Libya and the return of humanitarian intervention. And I should note that last point is handwritten in here. Events overtook this talk after I wrote it, so I'm trying to update on the fly. My explanation for why I think there's been so much continuity comes in two parts. The first part is that there are some long-term continuities in the world that simply create situations that presidents can't do much about. And there's both good news and bad news there. One long-term continuity is that President Obama inherited, as many of his predecessors did, for decades at least, a large alliance system. The United States has its allies in NATO, its allies in the Pacific, a bunch of other long-term relationships, and that creates a tremendous ballast in the ship of state. It's very hard to tip. The second long-term set of processes is a long-term process of relative American decline in the sense of the rise of alternative centers of power, especially China, to a lesser extent the other BRICS. And what both of those processes do is limit the president's room to maneuver. And each president has correspondingly less room to maneuver as the second one continues. So that's one set of reasons why policy doesn't change too much. The second set of reasons is a specific legacy of George Bush. You have massive economic and fiscal problems that this president inherited, massively overstretched U.S. military, hyper-partisanship in domestic politics, the low popularity of the U.S. abroad, and weakened international institutions. Every one of those things is pivotally important in constraining the ability of Obama to do precisely the sorts of things that Obama wanted to do. And then a third thing, which is kind of related to the second, is that many of President Obama's ideas going into office, that is to say democratic foreign policy thinking in general, was as much about what Bush should have done than about what the U.S. ought to do now, right? And everybody knows what Democrats think Bush should have done, but it's now too late to do. For example, don't invade Iraq. All right, negotiate with the Iranians before it's too late. Right? In both cases, I think by the time Obama got in, it is too late. Right? You can't negotiate with Iraq in 2009 from the status quo of 2003. And nor can you deal with Iraq from that basis. So that's kind of what I want to do and where I'm going. The way I'm going to organize my talk is to start by comparing the economic context in which Bush and Obama inherited. Then talk about the international situation each inherited. Then I'll talk about Bush in a little bit of detail, what his national security strategy was, and kind of how that related to his policies. As a backdrop for, all right, how do you assess how much change there's been under Obama when I talk about his national security strategy document and his actual policies. And I'll conclude with a discussion of the Libya operation and what it suggests for the evolution of Obama's policy, since his document also it was overtaken by events, and so he's had to depart from what he wrote. All right, so let me start with the context and the economic context first. President Bush inherited a very rosy picture when it comes to the economy. He inherited a budget surplus of more than 2% of GDP in 2000. The national debt was about 58% of GDP and dropping, and that's by the least optimistic measure. Economic growth was 4.4% in 2000, the year Bush was elected, though it immediately dropped to 1.1% in 2001. I think you can't blame that on him. So he had a bit of a slowdown to deal with. The defense situation was one in which there were ongoing peacekeeping operations, especially in the Balkans, but no ongoing wars. Military spending was 3% of GDP, which was pretty close to the historical low from, for example, the interwar years, from before World War II, certainly the low since World War II. And you had a military that was simultaneously downsized and also a bit stretched by these peacekeeping operations. Obama, if you compare that, inherited a much bleaker situation on all of these fronts. The fiscal situation was a budget deficit of 3% of GDP in 2008, the year before he took office. This is a swing of about 5.5% in the negative direction. The national debt was 69% of GDP and rising. Wait, can you hear me? Okay, I was just talking in the wrong direction. Sorry. The combination of the recession, okay. Now I get to be American Idol and use one of these handheld mics. Okay. The other thing about this increase in the national debt is that all of it was held abroad. So every dollar that the United States spends surplus to its income, largely for international operations, is borrowed from abroad. So the United States is borrowing from the Chinese and the Japanese to throw its military weight around in the Middle East. So that's the fiscal situation. Obama inherited zero economic growth in 2008, negative 2.8% growth in 2009. His defense situation was obviously bogged down in two wars. 135,000 troops were deployed in Iraq when Obama walked in. Another 50,000 in Afghanistan. Totaled 500,000 U.S. troops deployed overseas at the time. So you have a massively overstretched. This is a third of the entire U.S. Defense force. And of course, it's worse than that because the deployability of those troops by then was limited by the fact that many of them had deployed several times before, rising rate of post-traumatic stress disorder and other problems. So you have a massively overstretched military. Military spending is 4.8% of GDP when Obama comes into office, so more than 50% higher than Bush had inherited. And then you have a domestic political situation that makes dealing with these problems extremely difficult. So, for example, if President Obama wanted to try terror suspects in U.S. courts under U.S. law, he faced a fear campaign that suggested that any such attempts at trials would threaten the safety of American citizens. The long-term deficit problem is driven by rising healthcare costs in the U.S. as elsewhere, but what you face there is the death panel scare, right? Any notion of introducing efficiency into a government-run healthcare system is called death panels. The medium-term deficit problem is driven by Bush tax cuts, but what we saw in the last few months was a political situation in which Obama was unable to reverse even the smallest portion of those tax cuts, politically incapable of doing so. So for every problem that Obama inherits, he inherits a political situation that makes it virtually impossible to address that problem. And that's just domestically, let alone the nature of the foreign problem itself. Okay, so that's the economic context. Then compare the international contexts that both inherited. All right, so Bush. What does Bush inherit? He inherits an expanded NATO and a newly democratic and stabilized East Central Europe, a renewed conventional forces in Europe treaty, and a Balkans, which had been the main trouble spot of the 90s, stabilized. Right? Once the Kosovo War is over, we haven't seen any more major violence in the West Balkans. So Bush inherits a stable Europe. He inherits a situation in which there are international inspections of North Korean nuclear sites. You have a restabilized Taiwan Straits after the '96 crisis, and a fairly stable relationship with China. In the Middle East, that's of course where the problems were. Bush inherits a policy of dual containment of Iran and Iraq that is falling apart, especially with the sanctions regime against Iraq. You have the failure of the Camp David negotiations of 2000, leading to the Second Intifada, so the next blow up in Israeli-Palestinian relations. You have the rise of Al Qaeda, the Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests of 1999, and then, of course, shortly after he takes office, you have 9/11, which represents obviously a crisis, but also an opportunity. It's a turning point in world history where the situation has become suddenly fundamentally malleable, and there's a lot of alternatives that Bush has at his disposal. What does Obama inherit? Well, he's got a NATO that's expanded even further to the Baltic states, creating even more problems with Russia. You've got the Russian invasion and dismemberment of Georgia just before he takes office. You have declining U.S. soft power. No news to you, but more Americans see U.S. influence as negative than see it as positive at the time Obama takes office. In Asia, you have a newly asserted China, nuclear cooperation agreement with India, one of Bush's great accomplishments, and you have a nuclear-armed North Korea, right? So instead of Bush coming in with inspections and a non-nuclear North Korea, you now have a nuclear North Korea. In the Middle East, well, the good news is Saddam Hussein is gone. Iraq is no longer a threat to its neighbors, and in fact, the situation in Iraq is stabilizing. The much derided surge that Bush had implemented in 2007, 2008 seems to have contributed to stabilizing the situation. On the other hand, Afghanistan is going down the tubes. The Taliban is resurgent. It turns out that there was nearly a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we now know, just before Ehud Olmert left office as Prime Minister of Israel, but that opportunity was missed. In the Middle East in general, if the U.S. image is bad in Europe, of course, it's worse in the Middle East. So, for example, in Egypt, 3/4 of Egyptians believe that the U.S. wants to weaken and divide the Arab world and impose American culture. These are poll questions. They're all separate questions. 3/4 of Egyptians agree the United States wants to do all of these bad things. Majorities in the region, across the region, believe that the U.S. abuses its power. You have al-Qaeda resurgent in Pakistan, Yemen, a couple of places in North Africa. You have the Iranian nuclear enrichment program advancing towards weapons capability. All right, the point here is that Obama inherited so many crises, his room for maneuver was limited. There simply wasn't a lot he could do about any of them because he had to do something about all of them. Now, the revolutions in the Middle East, in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, present, again, like the crisis of 9/11, a huge opportunity, but within this much more constrained room for maneuver that Obama inherited. All right, so that's all background. Let me talk a little bit about the national about Bush, I guess. Nope, I'm talking about the National Security Strategy documents. All right, just talk about what these two guys believe in on paper. Because the interesting thing about it is that these documents are honest, if you understand honest to be, well, I guess sincere is the right word. Both Bush and Obama put down on paper pretty much what they think about the way the world works and how they propose to alter it, or at least to respond to it. The themes that you see in the Bush document are very much the themes of the Bush administration, starting with triumphalism, right? One of the first things that the Bush administration says in its national security strategy document is that the Cold War ended in a decisive victory for the forces of freedom. In your face, commies, right? It's that's the way it reads from an American perspective, and that's the way it's intended to read. Bush said that he wanted to write something that the boys in the barber shop back in Texas would understand, and that's the way he wanted them to understand it. Is a stance of moral superiority. These values of freedom are right and true for every person in every society, and of course not stated but meant exactly the way we interpret them. We know what is right and moral, and everybody else has to listen. Right? There's a crusader aim in both senses of that term, to rid the world of evil, Bush's exact words. All right, and so inside there, of course, you have the principle of preventive war, and the famous line that was used by, I believe, both Rice and Bush, that you can't wait for a smoking gun because the smoking gun may come in the form of a mushroom cloud, right? And the way this works, of course, the whole logic of the Iraq War, as we all know, is to conflate the foreign policy problems presented by states developing weapons of mass destruction and the problems posed by terrorists. Assume it's sort of, and as they say, it's two sides of the same evil. If it's possible for a metaphor to be a lie, that's a good example of one. All right, and the way you deal with this, of course, is first of all unilateralism. That the U.S. will not wait for international consensus, and second of all, an assumption of U.S. material superiority. And I'm emphasizing this, it's not stated, but it's so important because Obama is quite explicit in his document that cannot be assumed. Right? So Bush had this material superiority, and he could simply take it for granted. And so these principles were then turned into some specific ideas that we all know, the global war on terrorism, right? So you have this conceptual framework for American foreign policy, absolutely open-ended and intentionally ill-defined, right? Global war on terrorism means anything we can label with terrorism, we can attack. Coercive democratization, right? Spreading democracy is good, therefore the U.S. can use military force to do it, and that will be better. Non-proliferation policy is replaced by counter-proliferation policy, right? Skepticism about the effectiveness of international institutions and international law. Instead, you do things like missile defense, right? You do what you can do unilaterally. At the same time, there is a very large and explicit element of cooperation, both in the document and in the policy. In the document, it says over and over again, the U.S. will work with others to achieve these goals, or will strengthen its alliances to achieve these goals. And of course, democracy is there, not only the coercive part, but some high-flown language about champion aspirations for human dignity as a major goal of American national security policy. All right, so compare that with the Obama document. First of all, as I mentioned, the Obama document reflects the economic crisis that Obama inherited. He says, our strategy starts by recognizing that our strength and influence abroad begins with the steps we take at home. Cannot assume material superiority. In fact, the name of the strategy is a strategy of national renewal and global leadership. Right? Instead of triumphalism, he flips to the opposite way of understanding American moral superiority, which is exemplarism. Right? Reflecting the old notion of John Quincy Adams, that the U.S. Goes not abroad and seeks in search of monsters to destroy. The best way to promote our values, Obama writes, is to live them. Instead of unilateralism, Obama emphasizes institutionalism, that the United States will pursue a rule-based international system that can advance our own interests by serving mutual interests. Instead of unilateralism, you also have comprehensive engagement. Work with friends and allies all over the world, and also major powers like Russia, China, and India. And this is actually quite similar, fundamentally similar to what Bush proposed to do, especially early in his administration, but making it a much higher priority than Bush did. And finally, there's a rejection of militarism. The document is very explicit in saying that the use of force is an absolute last resort, and it's practically ruled out that the U.S. will use force unilaterally. So these principles are then turned into some specifics. So instead of a global war on terror, you have a specific focus on defeating al-Qaeda, and an emphasis on places where al-Qaeda is strong. The document emphasizes stabilize Afghanistan and Pakistan, stabilize and cooperate with Yemen, Somalia, North Africa. It's very explicit about offering a constructive vision, as Obama writes, to contrast with the destructiveness of al-Qaeda. He writes explicitly about pursuing a world without nuclear weapons through arms control, and he specifically talks about nuclear arms control with Russia and also strengthening the non-proliferation regime. Especially, he writes about cradle-to-grave nuclear fuel management. He talks about the isolation of Iran and North Korea if they choose not to cooperate with international institutions. And he talks about promoting peace in the greater Middle East. All right, so that's the talk. What about the action? I think I'm running late, so I'll somewhat stint on my discussion of Bush since you know it all anyway. It's worth mentioning, though, that the centerpiece of Bush's economic policy was the notion that tax cuts would boost economic growth. And if that's the premise, I think one can state as a matter of fact that it failed. In the Clinton era, U.S. GDP growth averaged 3.9% of GDP per year. Under Bush, that was 2.1%. So economic growth was almost half under Bush than it was under Clinton over those whole 8-year periods. But of course, as I mentioned, the cost of this was trillions in new debts and an increase in 10% of GDP of the national debt. Okay, so specific policies. Counterterrorism. What can I say that you don't know? Toppling the Taliban was probably a good idea if you want to stop al-Qaeda, but just about everything else they did was, invasion of Iraq was counterproductive. Pakistan was destabilized. On the other hand, there was international cooperation. This is something, the piece of Bush's strategy that tends to be overlooked. There actually was a lot of international cooperation on counterterrorism. Bush meant it when he said he wanted to cooperate. just wanted to cooperate on his terms. And so you have, for example, international cooperation that weakened al-Qaeda affiliates in places like Indonesia, Jamaat Islamiyah, Abu Sayyaf Group in Philippines. There was effective international cooperation that did something to weaken terrorist groups all over the world. Terrorist financing initiatives that were multilateral, global, and quite effective. So there is this sort of dualism there. There is more multilateralism than Bush gets credit for. Counterproliferation, well, the obvious point is that tough talk towards Iran and North Korea failed, right? Both nuclear programs progressed further in spite of Bush's tough talk because it was not supported by tough action, because Bush was focused instead on Iraq, which was the one that didn't have the nuclear weapons program. On the other hand, Libya agreed to disarm, so you have to consider that a success. Coercive democratization, I won't even bother. We know the answer there. Global cooperation in the global war on terror, well, as I said, there was a fair amount of it. Counterterrorism policy is largely a matter of intelligence information being turned up that allows the FBI to approach its police counterparts in other countries and say, we've identified the following people as terrorists, please arrest them. There's an awful lot of that goes on, an awful lot of intelligence cooperation that makes those conclusions possible. So again, Bush managed to do some useful things then. Then there's, of course, champion human dignity as a goal of American foreign policy for Bush. And there are 3 words to say about that: Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib. So on to Obama. Putting all that as background, what is Obama doing and what can he do? Well, all right, start with this revitalization at home thing, right? Obama recognizes the United States can't do anything abroad unless its situation at home is stable. And so his first priority was a bailout package of nearly $1 trillion to get the American economy going. A stimulus package, plus the bailouts of financial institutions, which in fact stopped the financial crisis, prevented the recession from continuing, and generated weak economic growth. The long-term agenda has not been pursued. Little's been done on energy, education, infrastructure. So what you have is the crisis management worked, but the long-term revitalization, as Obama wants to call it, nothing's been done. On counterterrorism, what you have, the centerpiece of that, unfortunately, has been the surge in Afghanistan. Right? So what do you have? You have an indirect effect against the Taliban, right? Not against al-Qaeda, with some short-term tactical successes in the field. But whether that's going to be sustained or not is at best uncertain. My assessment is unlikely. Because you're dealing with an inept and corrupt Afghan government. One of the great Democratic criticisms of Bush was that unilateralism meant you're not getting a lot of help in Afghanistan in the war that everybody agrees should have been fought. But what you have, of course, is a Europe that's tired of Afghanistan. Right? So going to Europe and asking NATO partners to provide more troops to fight in Afghanistan after 8 years, or now after 10, well, not a lot has been accomplished there. You have Pakistani military action in parts of Northwest Frontier Province against the resurgent Taliban. Consider that a success. On the other hand, absolute failure in efforts to split the Taliban alliance. Taliban is still allied with al-Qaeda. The Haqqani group is still allied with the Taliban, and so on. You have drone strikes that have killed some terrorist leaders, but of course at the cost of massive discontent with that policy, especially in Pakistan. You have Yemen described as a new crucible of terrorism. My assessment is there's been progress in counterterrorism, but limited progress with certainly no prospect of victory anytime soon. Non-proliferation, this is the big one, right? If you've got an American liberal view of the world, then ever since Jimmy Carter asked his daughter about it, nuclear proliferation is the #1 issue. for international security. And what's been achieved there? Well, essentially speaking, nothing. Right? You have the New START treaty with Russia, so the U.S. is back in compliance with the requirement that it work to disarm. But the central thing about the regime, if you want to strengthen the regime and make it do what it needs to do, you need the fissile material cutoff, right? And those talks have stalled. So multilateralism on the most important national security issue facing the United States is so fundamentally a failure that it's off the agenda. Nobody talks about it. It's on the it's off the public agenda, right? The State Department's still working on it, but it's not going anywhere. And of course, the Iranian nuclear program is progressing. The United States is unable to do anything to stop it, and probably won't be able to do anything to stop it. Regional conflict management, right? Obama decided that he is going to narrow the focus, right? We can't promote peace everywhere, but there are a few places where it really matters. And very near the top of that agenda is Israel-Palestine. Well, what happens there? You appoint poor George Mitchell, and you send him to mediate peace in a region where you've got an Israeli government that's the most right-wing ever. And so the talks almost instantly collapse. And the effort to pressure the Israelis into stopping the settlement process is, after a bit of time, an utter failure, with the Americans, not the Israelis, being the ones to retreat with their tails between their legs. So, not much progress there. Democracy promotion. So President Obama goes to Cairo, and in this famous speech, he does mention democracy, religious freedom, and women's rights. And of course, that means that Obama's partisans immediately take credit for the Arab rebellions Arab revolutions as being the result of Obama's Cairo speech, whereas of course Bush partisans say that no, really it's the result of Bush's 8 years of promoting democracy. There was a beautiful parody of this by John Stuart, which showed exactly these claims being made more explicitly than they usually are, with both sides agreeing only that it was U.S. policy that caused this, and conditions in the countries that had the revolutions were utterly irrelevant. Which is, well, actually, it's not too far off from the understanding on Capitol Hill, I think. One journalist went around and asked, especially members of Congress and congressional staffers, whether they knew what the difference was between Shiites and Sunnis, at least to the extent of knowing which sect was predominant in which country. And the answer was no, they didn't know. So that's what we're dealing with. On the other hand, okay, so you have the rhetoric of promoting democracy, but as I mentioned before, when the revolutions come in Egypt, especially, and Bahrain, Obama's very cautious, very quiet, due to pressure from other autocratic allies, right? The United States is not willing to sell its longtime friend Mubarak down the river, because of what will all of our other friends in the region say. All right, so how does Libya fit into this puzzle, right? In some sense, it doesn't, right? Military intervention for democracy promotion is not what Obama wanted to do. I mean, I didn't say a word about it before because that wasn't the intention, that wasn't the policy, but what you get is a crisis. So question one, why is the U.S. intervening at all? And answer number one I want to emphasize is reluctantly. The U.S. is militarily and fiscally overstretched. There's domestic political opposition to this. Point two, it's not an American operation. The intervention was requested by the Arab League, sort of reluctantly, promoted by the UN, and the operation, of course, was pushed by allies, especially France. The intervention was endorsed by UN Security Council resolution. So that's all important. This isn't a U.S. policy. This is the U.S. going along with international pressure from its allies. Third point, why is the U.S. doing this? Well, because Obama thinks that by doing so, he's being a good global citizen. One way of thinking about what's happened, and precisely one way of thinking about Obama's refusal to push hard on this issue, is to say that this is a triumph for Obama's policy of relying on international institutions, right? precisely to discredit the neoconservative argument that international institutions can't do anything. Right? International institutions can do something. By holding back, Obama gave the UN a chance to show that it could work without U.S. prodding. And it did. A fourth point. I think it's worth stating explicitly what the moral justification is for intervention in Libya. The metaphor I like to use is this. If you imagine that you are walking alone across a park and you see a person drowning in the park pond, the moral question is, do you have a moral responsibility to intervene? Right? You're the only person who can act. Do you have a moral responsibility to try to help the person who's drowning? The U.S. is often in that position because very often the U.S. is the only actor that can act in international humanitarian crises, in the sense that if the U.S. doesn't act, anything anybody else will do will be ineffective. Right? The U.S. action is necessary for the effectiveness of multilateral action. And I think that's the reason. I think it's genuinely reason, not just the PR reason, that the Obama administration looked at the situation and said, okay, if we do not act, and if we do not act now, there will be a slaughter in Benghazi. Tens of thousands of people will die, and we will be blamed for standing aside. So it's morally wrong to let it happen, and it's also bad politics. And of course, by the way, this is also perfectly legitimate under international law, because remember, there is a responsibility to protect that has been approved by UN action. So, the argument against, of course, is that U.S. bombs are killing people, and that isn't that bad, right? Fundamentally, that's what the objections come to. And the argument of the administration, and my argument is, no, it's not wrong. It's inappropriate and one-sided to look only at the cost of an action and not the benefits. So again, Gaddafi vowed no mercy on Benghazi, and probably intervention did save tens of thousands of lives. And so even if a few, mostly soldiers, have been killed in military action, still the balance of morality is in favor of the action rather than against it. More lives have been saved than have been cost by this intervention. The other point to keep in mind, I think, is the broader effects of the intervention. The wave of rebellions across the Arab world clearly shows the power of example, right? The Egyptians imitated the Tunisians, the Libyans imitated the Egyptians, and so on. Successful repression by Gaddafi would have set an example, too. It would have set an example for the remaining autocrats that extreme violence is the way to stay in power. And world inaction would have been, in fact, acquiescence to that. And it would have been construed as tacit support by everybody who wanted to carry out similar policies. And this, in turn, would have made it more likely, I believe, that the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia would take an authoritarian turn. Democracies acting assertively in support of, at least in opposition to autocratic repression, I think makes it more likely that democratic forces have a better chance of establishing something that looks vaguely like democracy in Tunisia and in Egypt. It's a message that the world community will not wink at repression. And it will make would-be dictators think twice about repression. So I'll leave it there. I want to leave time for questions. But that's my conclusion. Obama is so constrained by the Bush legacy that there's really a limit to what he can do in all the kind of traditional issues that he's faced with. But the current Arab revolutions represent the best opportunity to make a big positive difference. And while Obama's been probably a little bit too cautious in responding to it, my sense is he's actually doing generally the right things. But I'm interested in your thoughts about it.